Jade Walker stands motionless as 6 police officers point weapons at her, sweat dripping down her temple. Her military dogs, Sierra and Titan, suddenly emerge from behind her. The lead officer's face shifts from arrogance to terror upon recognizing the Special Forces insignia on the dogs' tactical vests. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever witnessed injustice and wanted to see it confronted. The way these officers freeze when they realize who they're really dealing with will leave you speechless. Jade Walker never expected to need her military training in her civilian life at 38. The former Marine Special Operations Command officer had built a quiet existence far from the battlefields of Afghanistan, where she'd earned her numerous decorations. Her small farm in rural South Carolina offered the peace she sought after 15 years of service to a country that didn't always serve her back. The 5 acres of rolling, green pastures bordered by pine forest had become home not just to her, but to Sierra and Titan, her 2 Belgian Malinois military dogs, who had served alongside her in combat zones. These weren't ordinary pets. Sierra, the female with intelligent amber eyes, could track a target through miles of terrain and recognize over 70 different command words in English and 4 other languages. Titan, larger and more imposing, specialized in tactical response and protection, capable of disabling armed threats with precision that human soldiers envied. Jade had personally trained them for special operations, refining their natural abilities into weapons more effective than any firearm they moved. Like shadows, when commanded, could distinguish friend from foe in seconds and would protect their handler with their live skills that had saved Jade and her team members repeatedly in war-torn villages and mountain hideouts. This particular Tuesday morning had begun. Like any other, Jade rose before dawn, ran 5 miles, with the dogs flanking her sides, then returned to tend her vegetable garden, where she grew most of her food. The simple routines helped manage the PTSD that still occasionally haunted her sleep. The neighboring town of Willow Creek had never fully embraced her, despite her service record. Jade encountered the same prejudices that had followed her throughout life. The farmer's market vendor who always claimed to be sold out when she approached the bank manager who questioned her loan application for farm equipment with unnecessary scrutiny. The police officer who followed her truck through town without cause. She learned to expect it to armor herself against it, choosing isolation over confrontation. Today, that choice was stripped away when she looked up from her tomato plants to see 3 police cruisers skidding to a halt at the end of her gravel driveway, lights flashing. 2 more vehicles quickly appeared surrounding her property in a show of force that seemed wildly disproportionate. The Willow Creek Police Department had a history in the county. 3 complaints of excessive force against black motorists. Indeed, the past year alone, a teenager tased for looking suspicious while walking home from basketball practice. Formal reprimands buried in personnel files, nothing ever seemed to change. Jade straightened slowly, removing her gardening gloves. She kept her movements deliberate, her face neutral despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. Sierra and Titan were inside the house, resting after their morning run. With a subtle movement, she pressed the side button on her watch, a silent signal to the dogs to remain in position until called. 6 officers emerged from the vehicles. Tactical vests over blue uniforms, hands resting on holstered weapons. Leading them was Captain James Reynolds, a man whose reputation preceded him in his 20 years on the force. Reynolds had amassed more civilian complaints than any other officer, most filed by minority residents, all mysteriously dismissed. His narrow face tightened into a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes as he approached. "M. Walker," he called out, not bothering to hide the contempt in his voice. "We need to have a word with you." Jade remained where she stood, her military training taking over as she assessed the threat 6 officers, all armed, forming a semicircle to prevent escape routes. No warrant visible. No emergency vehicles, suggesting an actual crisis. Just a show of intimidation on her private property. "Good morning, officers," she replied evenly. "How can I help you?" Reynolds stopped 10 feet away, his hand now resting more deliberately on his weapon. "We've received reports of suspicious activity on this property. We're here to investigate." Jade took a slow breath. Suspicious activity was the blanket excuse she'd heard used against people who looked like her. All her life. "I'd be happy to answer any questions," she said, "but I'd like to see a warrant before you come any further onto my property." Reynolds' face darkened at the request behind him. The other officers shifted positions, spreading out in a tactical formation that Jade recognized immediately. This wasn't a casual visit. They had come prepared for confrontation, perhaps hoping for it. "We don't need a warrant. When we have probable cause," Reynolds snapped his patience, already wearing thin multiple reports of suspicious individuals coming and going from this property at odd hours. Jade knew this tactic well. Vague accusations, impossible to disprove. The only visitors to her farm in the past month had been the veterinarian and a fellow veteran who dropped off homemade bread every Sunday after church. Both white, both unlikely to trigger suspicious individual reports. This was harassment, plain and simple. "Captain Reynolds." Jade replied, her voice steady from years of crisis negotiation training. "I respect law enforcement, but you know as well as I do that you need specific evidence of a crime in progress to enter private property. Without a warrant, I'm not aware of any emergency that would justify this." The flash of anger in Reynolds' eyes confirmed what Jade already suspected. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone who knew her rights. She thought back to her combat training. Maintain composure, under pressure control. Your breathing. Assess all possible outcomes in Afghanistan. She had negotiated with warlords and tribal elders in situations far more volatile than this. Yet something about facing discrimination on American soil, wearing gardening clothes instead of a uniform, made the injustice cut deeper. "Boys," Reynolds said, without taking his eyes off Jade, "let's have a look around. Ms. Walker here might be hiding something worth finding." 2 officers immediately headed toward her barn, while another approached her garden shed. Jade felt her chest tighten. "I do not consent to a search of my property," she stated firmly. "Either produce a warrant or leave now." The officers ignored her. Trampling through her carefully tended vegetable rows, one kicked over a basket of freshly harvested tomatoes, the red fruit bursting on impact. Another pulled open her shed door, rummaging through tools and supplies. The deliberate destruction wasn't about finding evidence. It was meant to provoke her into a reaction they could use against her. Standing slightly behind Reynolds was a younger officer Jade hadn't seen before. His name tag read Bennett, and unlike the others, he appeared uncomfortable with the proceedings. His eyes darted between his colleagues and Jade, his posture hesitant rather than aggressive. A rookie perhaps not yet fully indoctrinated into the department's culture, with subtle movements that wouldn't draw attention. Jade reached into her pocket and pressed the activation switch on a small recording device, a precaution she'd started carrying after her first encounter with local law enforcement. The dogs remained inside the house, invisible but alert. They were trained to respond to specific voice commands and hand signals to remain hidden until deployed. The ultimate surprise tactical advantage. Reynolds stepped closer, invading her personal space in a classic intimidation technique. "Your kind always thinks you're special," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Military service doesn't make you better than anyone else. doesn't change what you are. The racial undertone was unmistakable. Jade felt anger rising like a tide but kept her expression neutral. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. They want your anger. It justifies their fear. Don't give them what they want. One of the officers called out from the barn. Nothing here, Cap. Reynolds didn't take his eyes off Jade. Keep looking. Check the house next. This crossed the line. You are not entering my home without a warrant. Jade stated, her voice now taking on the command tone she'd used in combat situations. That is a constitutional violation, and you know it, Reynolds smirked. You threatening an officer? Miss Walker? Because that sounds like threatening behavior to me. Boys, did you hear her threatening tone? The other officers murmured agreement. The choreography of this abuse of power all too familiar. The young officer Bennett remained silent, his discomfort now visible even to Reynolds, who shot him a warning glance. Jade recognized the escalation strategy they were building. A pretext, manufacturing a reason to detain her. Or worse, each officer was positioned to block escape routes, their stances suggesting they expected, perhaps hoped for, physical resistance. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with Reynolds pushing harder for the reaction he wanted. I served this country for 15 years, Jade said, addressing all the officers. Now, I've upheld our Constitution overseas, and I expect the same respect for it here. What you're doing is illegal. Reynolds laughed, a harsh sound without humor, playing the veteran card. Now, let me tell you something about your service people. Like you always think a uniform makes you equal. It doesn't. You think anybody cares? You played soldier for a few years. In my town, you're just another. He caught himself before finishing the slur, glancing at Bennett. But the intent was clear enough. Another. What, Captain Reynolds? Jade asked quietly. Please finish your thought for the record. She saw uncertainty flicker across his face as he registered her words for the record. He glanced at her hand in her pocket, suddenly wondering if he was being recorded. The momentary doubt was quickly replaced by renewed anger. Search the house. He ordered the officers. If she resists, arrest her for obstruction. As two officers approached her porch steps, Jade planted herself in their path. This stops now, she said, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded troops in battle. You have no legal right to enter my home. Reynolds moved toward her, his hand now unnapping his holster. Last warning. Miss Walker, step aside or face arrest. What forces truly shape the experiences of Black Americans in a system designed without them in mind? This question had followed Jade throughout her military career, where excellence was often the minimum requirement just to be treated equally. She remembered reporting for her first day of advanced training, how the commanding officer had looked right through her. Asking when the actual candidate would arrive, she recalled her grandfather, Thomas Walker, a Korean War veteran who returned home to find he couldn't use the same drinking fountain as the white soldiers he'd fought alongside. The uniform changes, nothing he told her when she enlisted. Remember that, and you'll survive. Those words echoed now as Reynolds squared off against her on her own property. Officer, Bennett shifted uncomfortably, then cleared his throat. Captain, he said quietly. Dispatch, just called in a traffic accident on Highway 16. Multiple vehicles. Reynolds didn't even turn to acknowledge him. They've got patrol cars for that, Bennett persisted. Sir, don't you think we should? Did I ask for your opinion? Bennett. Reynolds snapped focus on why we're here. The young officer fell silent. But his intervention confirmed what Jade suspected. This operation wasn't standard procedure. It was targeted, personal. 3 weeks earlier, Jade had filed a formal complaint against the department after witnessing officers harass a Black teenager outside the grocery store. She'd recorded the incident, identifying Reynolds as the primary aggressor. The complaint had made its way to the county review board, bypassing the police chief, who happened to be Reynolds' cousin, and had buried similar complaints for years now it made. Since this wasn't random harassment, it was retaliation through the kitchen window. Jade caught a glimpse of Sierra and Titan perfectly still watching the scene unfold. Their training allowed them to remain motionless for hours when required invisible sentinels awaiting commands from the corner of her eye. Jade noticed one officer slip behind her, shut out of view from the others. Something about his movements triggered her combat instincts. She shifted position slightly to keep him in peripheral vision. The officer glanced around, then reached into his pocket and appeared to place something inside her storage bin. Planting evidence, the realization hit her like ice water. They weren't just here to intimidate, they were setting her up. The pieces connected rapidly in her mind. The excessive force, the determination to search her property, the manufactured pretext they needed to discredit her before the review board hearing a drug charge would do that perfectly, undermining her credibility and dismissing her complaint in one stroke. Reynolds was watching her face, looking for any reaction that would justify escalation. She kept her expression neutral, mentally calculating her options. Direct confrontation would play into their hands. Retreat into the house might give them the suspicious behavior. Excuse, they wanted her. Military training kicked in. Assess threats. Identify vulnerabilities. Create leverage. The corrupt officer finished his task and rejoined the others, giving Reynolds a subtle nod. Jade pretended not to notice. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The officer, planting evidence, had triggered her property's hidden security system. The cameras were now recording everything. Footage automatically uploading to a secure cloud server technology that had kept her alive in war zones now served a new purpose. Mrs. Walker Reynolds said, "We've been patient, but our patience has limits. Either you cooperate with our investigation, or we'll be forced to detain you for obstruction." Behind him, a vehicle appeared at the end of her driveway. A white van with a local news station logo. Jade had programmed her security system to alert local media if multiple police vehicles remained on her property. For more than 15 minutes, Reynolds turned at the sound of tires on gravel, his expression darkening when he saw the news van. "Who called them?" he demanded of his officers. No one answered. The journalist, a young woman with a camera already mounted on her shoulder, approached with confident strides. "Good morning," she called out. "Lisa Chen from Channel 7 News. We received an anonymous tip about police activity at a veteran's residence. Mind if I ask what's happening here?" Reynolds moved to intercept her. "This is an active police investigation. You need to leave immediately." The reporter stood her ground. "We're on a public access road." "Captain, we have every right to document police activity from this position." She raised her camera, capturing the scene of multiple officers surrounding a single black woman on her own property. "Are you executing a warrant today? Do you believe this harassment was justified? What would you do in Jade's position?" Comment number 1. If you think filing the complaint was the right decision despite the consequences, or number 2. If you think sometimes it's safer to stay silent in a broken system like this video. If you believe those who serve our country deserve better treatment, when they return home, subscribe to follow Jade's fight against a system stacked against her. The question remains, when the people meant to protect you become the threat, who can you turn to for justice? Let's see how Jade handles this escalating situation. The presence of the news camera clearly agitated Reynolds, who gestured for 2 officers to block the reporter's view. Jade remained outwardly calm, while inwardly calculating her next move. The journalist's arrival had changed the dynamic, providing potential witnesses to whatever happened next. Reynolds turned back to Jade, his face flushed with anger. "This little stunt with the media won't help you," he said, voice low and threatening. "We're conducting a legitimate investigation, and interference will only make things worse for you." Jade measured her response carefully. "There's nothing legitimate about this, Captain Reynolds. You have no warrant, no probable cause, and you're trespassing on private property. I've asked you multiple times to leave." Her phone began ringing in her pocket. Her lawyer, Marcus Gaines, who she'd programmed as a speed dial emergency contact, Reynolds noticed the buzzing sound and his eyes narrowed, taking a call during a police interaction. "Hand over the phone now." Jade slowly reached for her phone. "I have the right to contact my attorney." Before she could answer, Reynolds snatched the device from her hand and threw it onto the gravel driveway, where the screen shattered. "Oops," he said, with mock concern. "Looks like you've got a broken phone. Maybe you should be more careful with your possessions." The deliberate destruction of her property captured on both her security cameras, and now the news footage, was exactly the kind of escalation that revealed Reynolds' true intent. He wasn't here to investigate anything. He wanted confrontation in the distance. Jade noticed Bennett watching the scene with visible discomfort, his hand hovering near his own phone, as if considering whether to intervene. The other officers had begun a more aggressive search of her property. One knocked over a memorial flagpole that held both the American flag and a Marine Corps flag, letting them fall into the dirt. Another officer deliberately trampled through her vegetable garden, destroying weeks of work with casual indifference. These weren't random acts of carelessness. They were calculated provocations, Lisa Chen, the reporter, had maneuvered to capture more footage despite the officer's attempts to block her view. "Captain Reynolds," she called out, "can you explain why 6 officers are needed to question one unarmed civilian? Does this standard procedure for the Willow Creek Police Department?" Reynolds spun toward her. "Back away now, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business." The journalist stood her ground. "The First Amendment protects my right to document police activity." "Captain, I'm not interfering with anything." Reynolds gestured to 2 officers. "Remove her from the property line. If she resists, arrest her." The reporter quickly backed up. "I'm on public property now." "Officers, any attempt to detain me would be unlawful." She continued, filming from a legally safe distance. Reynolds returned his attention to Jade, stepping closer until he stood directly before her. His voice dropped to ensure only she could hear him. "You think you're so smart with your complaints and your cameras? Nobody cares about another troublemaker claiming police harassment when we find what we're looking for in that shed. You'll be just another criminal with a story nobody believes." The reference to the shed confirmed Jade's suspicion about the planted evidence. She said nothing, maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her through firefights and ambushes in war zones far more dangerous than her own front yard. Reynolds mistook her silence for submission. He stepped even closer, his face inches from hers. "People like you don't belong in Willow Creek. After today, maybe you'll finally get the message." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. Behind Reynolds, Jade could see Bennett taking out his phone, apparently sending a text while his colleagues were distracted. A potential ally, or simply a witness, unwilling to participate in the corruption unfolding before him. Her tactical assessment continued. 6 officers, 1 possibly sympathetic, 1 journalist providing documentation, unknown quantities. How far Reynolds was willing to go. How much evidence had been planted? How many neighbors might be watching from a distance? The balance of power remained with the police, but the dynamics were shifting. Reynolds abruptly reached out and shoved Jade backward, causing her to stumble against the porch steps. "Stop resisting," he shouted loud enough for all to hear. Though she had done nothing of the sort, the manufactured pretext was as transparent as it was dangerous. Resisting arrest had preceded countless incidents of police brutality. This was the moment where countless similar encounters had turned deadly. Reynolds' hand moved toward his holster as he advanced on her again. "I said stop resisting," the journalist's voice called out. "She's not resisting. I have everything on camera, Captain." Reynolds ignored her, focused entirely on Jade, who had regained her balance and now stood at the bottom of her porch steps, his face contorted with a rage that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Unless the situation was exactly what Jade suspected, a deliberate setup to silence her complaint through intimidation. Or worse, last warning, Reynolds said, unnapping his holster, on the ground now. "Or I will consider you a threat." Time seemed to slow as Jade made her decision. Compliance might save her in the moment, but would surrender her rights and dignity. Resistance would play into their hands, giving them the excuse they sought. Her military training offered a third option. With deliberate calm, she raised her hands to shoulder height, palms forward, in a universal gesture of non-aggression. Then, with precision, timing, she gave a short, sharp whistle, a specific frequency that would be meaningless to anyone else but carried crystal clear our instructions to her dogs. Reynolds frowned momentarily, confused by the whistle. "What do you think you're—" The sound of the front door opening cut him off mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward the house. Sierra and Titan emerged from the doorway with military precision, moving in perfect formation as they descended the porch steps. Both dogs wore their tactical vests, black Kevlar, with official military insignia and specialized equipment pouches. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. These weren't pets appearing to defend their owner. They were military assets deploying to secure a perimeter. Sierra, the lighter of the two with her intense amber eyes, moved to the right in a E-flanking position. Titan 90 Solalabri of muscle and discipline positioned himself directly between Jade and Reynolds. Both dogs moved with the silent, controlled purpose that marked their special operations training. There was no barking, no growling, just calculated positioning and absolute focus. The officers froze their hands instinctively, moved toward their weapons. But something about the dog's demeanor made them hesitate. These animals didn't behave like aggressive pets. They moved with tactical intent that the officers recognized on some instinctive level. Rhines took an involuntary step backward, his face registering confusion before settling into forced bravado. "Control your animals immediately," he ordered, his voice lacking its previous authority. Jade stood perfectly still, her posture straightening subtly into the command stance she'd used for years in combat zones. "Sire, Titan, hold position," she said calmly. The dogs responded instantly, stopping their advance but maintaining their defensive formation. Their training allowed them to remain in position for hours if necessary. Alert and ready to respond to dozens of verbal or hand signal commands, Officer Bennett's eyes widened as he noticed the military working dog insignia on the tactical vests. "Captain," he said quietly, "those are military working dogs. Special operations." The recognition spread among the other officers, creating a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Military working dogs weren't just trained pets. They were classified as specialized equipment in combat zones, capable of detecting explosives, tracking targets through impossible terrain, and taking down armed enemies with precision that saved countless lives. Jade had served as a handler in the Marine Special Operations Command's K9 unit deploying with Sierra and Titan on classified missions across Afghanistan. Their capabilities had been honed through thousands of hours of specialized training, making them extensions of their handler in high-threat environments. "My dogs are trained federal assets," Jade stated, her voice carrying the authority of her military rank without raising its volume. "They respond to over 100 verbal and nonverbal commands. They're currently in defensive positioning only." The implication was clear to anyone with law enforcement or military background. These animals could switch from defensive to offensive tactics with a single word. Reynolds struggled to maintain his composure, his hand hovering uncertainly near his weapon. "This is intimidation of police officers," he attempted, though the accusation sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Sir, this is literally the opposite of what's happening here," Bennett said, surprising both his colleagues and himself with the direct challenge. "We showed up 6 officers, strong, to question one person without a warrant." The rookie's unexpected intervention created a moment of stunned silence. Jade used it to her advantage. "Captain Reynolds, I've asked you multiple times to leave my property unless you have a warrant. You've destroyed my personal property, threatened me, and attempted to plant evidence in my shed. All of this has been recorded by my security system and is being live-reamed to my attorney as we speak. At the mention of recordings and planted evidence, the officer who had visited the shed earlier shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances with his partner. The journalist had repositioned herself for a better angle, capturing the standoff between the police officers and the military-trained dogs. "Miss Walker?" she called out. "Are you saying these officers planted evidence on your property?" Before Jade could answer, a new vehicle appeared on the road, the county sheriff's cruiser lights flashing, but sirens silent. The jurisdictional implications weren't lost on anyone present. While the Willow Creek Police Department had authority within town limits, the county sheriff had broader jurisdiction that superseded city police in cases of potential misconduct. Sheriff Daniels, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, stepped out of his vehicle and surveyed the scene with evident disapproval. His gaze took in the multiple police cruisers, the news van, the trampled garden, and finally settled on the standoff between his officers and a black woman with 2 military-grade dogs. "Rhines," he called out as he approached. "What exactly is going on here?" The captain straightened clearly, uncomfortable with his superior's arrival routine. "Investigation based on reports of suspicious activity." "Sir," Sheriff Daniels looked pointedly at the lack of paperwork in Reynolds' hands. "I assume you have a warrant for this routine investigation on private property?" The silence that followed was answer enough. The sheriff turned to Jade. "Ma'am, I apologize for this intrusion. I received a call from a concerned citizen about potential police misconduct." His eyes flicked to Bennett, suggesting the source of the alert. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you're comfortable with that." Reynolds stepped forward. "Sir, we have reason to believe there are illicit substances on the property. We were just about to search the shed when what Captain Sheriff Daniels cut him off, when her highly trained military dogs appeared, or when the news crew showed up to document whatever happens next." He gestured toward the news van. "This doesn't look like procedure to me. This looks like harassment." The power dynamic had shifted completely. Reynolds' face flushed with anger and embarrassment. As his authority was publicly undermined, the other officers began to distance themselves slightly, reading the changing situation. Bennett's expression showed relief. Jade maintained her composure, aware that the danger hadn't fully passed. "Sheriff," she said, "the officers placed something in my storage container beside the shed approximately 20 minutes ago. I believe it was an attempt to plant evidence." Sheriff Daniels' expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation, one that my security cameras and the news footage can verify," Jade replied. She gave another hand signal to the dogs, and Sierra moved to sit at attention while Titan maintained his protective stance. Their disciplined response made it clear these weren't ordinary animals, but specialized partners trained for complex operations. The sheriff turned to the Channel 7 reporter, Ms. Chen. "I presume you have footage of everything that's transpired here?" The journalist nodded. "Rolling from the moment we arrived." "Sheriff, I'll need a copy of that footage as evidence. He turned back to Reynolds' captain. I'm ordering you and your officers to stand down and return to the station immediately. There will be a full investigation into this incident. Reynolds' jaw tightened with all due respect. Sheriff, you're interfering with the police operation. To know? Captain Sheriff Daniels replied firmly, I'm preventing what appears to be a clear violation of constitutional rights and potential evidence tampering. We'll discuss this further at the station. He turned to the other officers. All of you back to your vehicles now. That's an order. The officers hesitated, caught between their direct superior and the county sheriff, who technically outranked him. One by one, they began retreating toward their cruisers, leaving Reynolds increasingly isolated. The captain's face contorted with barely contained rage as he realized his operation was collapsing. This isn't over, he said to Jade, voice low enough that only she could hear people. Like you don't win against people like me. Remember that? With that final threat, he turned and stormed back to his vehicle. The assembled officers drove away, leaving only Sheriff Daniels, Officer Bennett, who had remained behind at the sheriff's request, and the news crew documenting everything from the roadside. What happens when those sworn to uphold the law become its greatest threat? How do the vulnerable find protection in a system that was never designed to serve them equally? As the police cruisers disappeared down the road, Jade's phone buzzed with an incoming text. Despite its shattered screen, the message came from an unfamiliar number. Sentinel Protocol. Activated assets, inbound hold position. Jade felt a wave of recognition wash over her. The Sentinel Protocol wasn't official. Military procedure, it was something more personal, more necessary. It had begun 3 years ago after Marcus Williams, a decorated Black Marine veteran, was killed by police during a routine traffic stop in Arizona. His death sparked outrage, but little justice in response. A network of veterans, particularly veterans of color, created an informal protection system. Using encrypted communications and leveraging their military connections, they established protocols to monitor and respond when fellow veterans faced harassment or danger. Jade had helped design the system, but never expected to activate it herself. The automated alerts from her security system had triggered the protocol, sending notifications to a network of veterans within a 50 mi radius within minutes of Reynolds' departure. 2 pickup trucks appeared on the road, driven by men and women. Jade recognized from local veteran support groups. They parked at a respectful distance, simply establishing presence without interference. More would arrive soon. A show of solidarity that sent a clear message. She wasn't alone. Sheriff Daniels noticed the arrivals with a raised eyebrow. Friends of yours, he asked. Jade nodded. Fellow veterans, word travels fast when one of our own is in trouble. The sheriff seemed to understand the implications. He'd served in the Army before joining law enforcement, and recognized the brotherhood and sisterhood that transcended civilian divisions. Miss Walker, he said, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This isn't how law enforcement should operate in my county. He turned to Officer Bennett. Tell me exactly what led to this operation. Bennett swallowed nervously. Captain Reynolds called it in as a priority response to suspicious activity, sir. But there was no briefing. No specific information. When I asked for details, he said to just follow his lead. He hesitated before continuing. This isn't the first time, sir. There's been a pattern with certain residents. Certain residents, the sheriff repeated. You mean residents of color? Bennett nodded uncomfortably. Yes, sir. Lisa Chen approached cautiously. Camera still recording. Sheriff, would you be willing to comment on what appears to be a case of police harassment against a military veteran? Sheriff Daniels considered the question carefully. What I can say is that I'm deeply concerned by what I've witnessed and will be conducting a thorough investigation. The Willow Creek Police Department falls under county oversight, and I take allegations of misconduct very seriously." He turned back to Jade Walker. "I understand. You filed a complaint against Captain Reynolds recently." 3 weeks ago," Jade confirmed. "I witnessed him harassing a black teenager outside the grocery store. The complaint was forwarded to the county review board because I didn't trust it would be handled properly through internal channels." The sheriff nodded grimly. "The review board is scheduled to hear that case next week." The timing of today's investigation seems far from coincidental. Jade's phone buzzed again. This time, it was her attorney, Marcus Gaines, calling through the cracked screen. "Jade, I've been watching the live stream from your security system. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him. Sheriff Daniels arrived and diffused the situation. "I'm 10 minutes out," Marcus said. "I've already filed for an emergency injunction against the Willow Creek PD to prevent any further harassment, and I'm bringing the county prosecutor with me. She wants to see that shed where evidence was allegedly planted." As Jade ended the call, she noticed Sierra's ears perk up, detecting movement from the treine behind her property with a subtle hand signal. She directed both dogs to defensive positions, a precaution born from years in environments where threats rarely announced themselves. Sheriff Daniels noticed the change in the dog's demeanor. "Problem?" he asked, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Just being cautious," Jade replied. "Reynolds isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully." The sheriff nodded in understanding. "Bennett, secure the shed. Nothing gets removed until the prosecutor arrives." As Bennett moved toward the shed, a black SUV with government plates pulled into the driveway. 2 men in suits emerged. They're bearing unmistakably military, despite their civilian clothes. "Miss Walker," the taller one called out, showing credentials as he approached. "Agent Michael's Department of Defense. We received an alert about potential harassment of a former Special Operations asset." The speed of the response confirmed what Jade had always suspected. The Sentinel protocol had support from within the military structure itself, unofficial, but effective. "Agent." Michaels surveyed the scene with practice deficiency. "I see the situation is under control, but we'll be documenting everything for our records. Interference with military veterans, particularly those with classified backgrounds, falls under federal jurisdiction when civil rights violations are involved." Sheriff Daniels looked surprised, but not displeased by the federal presence. "I welcome any assistance in ensuring justice is properly served." "Agent." While they spoke, more vehicles arrived. 3 more veterans in civilian clothes, the county prosecutor in her official car, and Jade's attorney, Marcus Gaines. What had begun as an isolated intimidation attempt had transformed into a multi-agency response that would be impossible to sweep under the rug. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valencia Torres, headed straight for the shed without preamble. "Sheriff, I want that container sealed and photographed exactly as it is," as she organized the evidence collection. Marcus approached Jade with evident concern. "Are you sure you're all right?" "This goes beyond harassment. This was a deliberate setup." Jade nodded. "I'm fine, better than Reynolds." At this point, the impromptu gathering on her property had taken on the atmosphere of a command center, with veterans securing the perimeter, law enforcement documenting evidence, and federal agents taking statements. The journalist continued recording, providing public accountability that would make interference difficult. Officer Bennett approached Jade tentatively. "Walker, I want to apologize. I should have spoken up sooner." Jade studied him carefully. "Why didn't you?" Bennett looked ashamed. "Fear. I'm still on probation." But there's something you should know. Reynolds has been targeting specific properties in this area, properties owned by minorities, especially those near the planned resort development. This new information shifted Jade's understanding of the situation. Her land bordered the proposed site of a luxury resort that had faced opposition from environmental groups. If Reynolds was targeting minority landowners near the development, the police chief's brother-in-law is the developer. Bennett continued quietly. There's been pressure to clean up the area around the resort site, make it more appealing to investors. The conspiracy was larger and more calculated than Jade had imagined. Not just racial harassment, but economic exploitation, using police power as the weapon. Do you believe police departments should have independent civilian oversight, boards with real power? Comment number 1 if you think external. Accountability is essential for preventing abuse of power. Or number 2, if you believe police should primarily be accountable to themselves like this video. If you support veterans standing up for one another against injustice, subscribe to see how Jade's battle against corruption unfolds as she discovers just how deep the conspiracy goes. The question now becomes, when the corruption extends beyond one officer to entire systems of power, can justice ever truly be served? Let's find out what happens next. The revelation that Reynolds' harassment was part of a larger scheme to pressure minority landowners into selling their properties added a new dimension to the confrontation. What had appeared to be individual prejudice was actually systemic corruption, with economic motivations behind the racial targeting. Sheriff Daniels overheard Bennett's disclosure and approached with a grave expression. "Officer, are you willing to make an official statement about this?" Bennett hesitated visibly, wrestling with the potential consequences. "I have a family, sir. A new baby." "I understand the risks," the sheriff acknowledged. "But if what you're saying is true, this goes beyond harassment to criminal conspiracy." The prosecutor Torres joined them. After securing the shed, we found a package of what appears to be methamphetamine hidden in the storage container. The packaging has minimal, just compared to everything around it, consistent with recent placement and preliminary review of the security footage. Shows Officer Delaney placing something in that exact location. She turned to Bennett. "Your testimony could be crucial in building a case." The young officer straightened his shoulders, coming to a decision. "I'll testify. There have been at least 7 similar incidents in the past 3 months, all targeting minority property owners around the resort development area. Captain Reynolds called them property improvement operations pressure campaigns to force people to sell." As Bennett detailed the pattern of harassment, Agent Michaels made a call to his superiors. The Department of Defense had jurisdiction when veterans were targeted, but this conspiracy potentially involved federal civil rights violations that would bring in the FBI. Jade watched the machinery of accountability slowly engage multiple agencies, witnesses, evidence collection. Yet experience had taught her that power protected itself fiercely. Reynolds might face consequences, but would the system that enabled him be truly challenged? Her phone buzzed with incoming messages. Other veterans and community members responding to the news that was now spreading through local networks. The Channel 7 van had been joined by 2 more media outlets drawn by Lisa Chen's initial reporting. The story was growing beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Sheriff Daniels approached Jade again. "Miss Walker, we've received reports that Police Chief Wilson is attempting to seize the evidence from your shed and the security footage I've stationed. Deputies at the evidence. Lockup to prevent tampering. But this situation is escalating quickly." The mention of evidence seizure triggered Jade's tactical instincts. "Seer perimeter check," she commanded quietly. The dog immediately moved in a precise pattern around the property. checking for potential threats or surveillance, a precaution that had saved lives in combat zones. Torres. The prosecutor observed the dog's methodical movement with professional appreciation. Military. Working dogs, she noted. I worked with similar units during my JAG service. Remarkable animals. She turned to Jade with newfound respect. Your background explains why they targeted you so aggressively. Veterans with specialized training represent a particular threat to corrupt systems. You know how to document secure evidence and navigate bureaucracy. The observation struck Jade as sadly accurate. Her military experience had made her both a target and unusually equipped to defend herself. Many others in the community lacked such resources. This isn't just about me, she said. Bennett mentioned 7 other properties targeted. Those people deserve justice too. Torres nodded. We'll need to identify and contact them all. This could potentially become a class action civil rights case. As they spoke, a commotion at the edge of the property drew their attention. Police Chief Wilson had arrived with 4 officers attempting to establish a perimeter of their own. Sheriff Daniels immediately moved to intercept them, creating a jurisdictional standoff that highlighted the fractured nature of local authority. This is an active investigation under county jurisdiction, the sheriff stated firmly. Your department is the subject of that investigation. Chief Wilson, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Wilson, a heavier man with the same cold eyes as his cousin Reynolds, stood his ground. We've received reports of evidence tampering at this location. The city has jurisdiction over. The city has jurisdiction over nothing when its own officers are implicated in misconduct. Torres interrupted, approaching with her prosecutor's badge clearly visible. Any attempt to interfere with this investigation will result in obstruction charges. Chief Wilson, I've already spoken with the State Attorney General, who is monitoring this situation personally. The reference to state-level attention caused Wilson to hesitate. Behind him, his officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. The arrival of 2 state police vehicles further shifted the balance of power. The state officers positioned themselves strategically, making it clear they stood with the sheriff and prosecutor rather than the local police. More community members had gathered on the road, drawn by the unusual police presence and media attention among them. Jade recognized several of the people Bennett had referenced, other property owners who had faced similar harassment. Her attorney Marcus was already moving among them, collecting contact information and preliminary statements. The machinery of justice was grinding into motion slowly, but with increasing momentum. Agent Michaels rejoined the group. After his call, FBI agents will be arriving within the hour. This case now involves potential civil rights violations, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and abuse of power under color of authority, all of which fall under federal jurisdiction. Chief Wilson's face darkened at the mention of federal involvement. This is a local matter that's being blown completely out of proportion. One complaint doesn't justify this circus. One complaint, Torres echoed incredulously. We already have evidence of a pattern targeting multiple properties, planted evidence, documented harassment, and testimony from one of your own officers. This stopped being a local matter the moment your department decided to use police power for private financial gain. The chief's expression revealed that he hadn't expected Bennett's cooperation, a miscalculation that had exposed the entire operation. He retreated to his vehicle without further argument. Though his parting glance at Jade carried a clear threat, the confrontation had been diffused for now. But Jade knew better than to underestimate desperate people with badges and guns. Sierra returned from her perimeter check and sat at attention beside Jade, signaling all clear. Titan remained in guard position, his training allowing him to maintain alert status for hours without fatigue. Sheriff Daniels watched the dogs with evident admiration. Those animals are something else. Military working dogs, right? Jade nodded. Sierra specializes in detection and tracking, Titan in protection and tactical response. We served 3 tours together in Afghanistan. Special operations. The question was asked casually, but Jade recognized the intent behind it. Her specific role remained classified, though her general service was public record. I was a dog handler attached to Marine Special Operations units, she said, providing the unclassified version of her service. The sheriff seemed to understand the distinction. Well, I'm glad you had them here today. This situation could have gone very differently as the afternoon progressed. Jade's property transformed into an impromptu command center. The FBI agents arrived and established their own evidence collection protocol, working alongside the state police and prosecutor's office. Community members organized themselves into support groups, sharing their experiences with investigators and media veterans, maintained a protective presence, their military bearing, and quiet professionalism. A reminder of the discipline and service that connected them by evening. What had begun as an isolated act of harassment had evolved into a multi-agency investigation that threatened to expose years of systematic corruption. Jade observed the activity from her porch, Sierra and Titan resting at her feet after a long day of heightened alert. Despite the positive momentum, she remained vigilant. Her military experience had taught her that the most dangerous moment often came not during the initial confrontation, but in the aftermath, when threatened power structures fought to reassert control. The night brought a false sense of calm. Most of the officials had departed, with promises to return in the morning. The media vans maintained their vigil at the end of the driveway, their presence providing a thin layer of protection through visibility. Several veterans had volunteered to stay rotating watch shifts in their vehicles, an informal security detail born of shared service and solidarity. Jade didn't protest their presence. Her tactical assessment suggested Reynolds and Wilson wouldn't accept defeat without retaliation. Sierra and Titan remained on heightened alert, responding to subtle commands that kept them vigilant without exhausting their energy. Around 2:00 in the morning, Sierra's ears perked up, detecting movement beyond human hearing range. Jade was already awake, sleeping lightly, as she had learned to do in combat zones. Alert status? She whispered to both dogs, who immediately shifted to active positions without making a sound through her bedroom window. Jade could see shadows moving at the edge of her property, too organized to be wildlife, too cautious to be legitimate visitors. She activated her security systems, night vision cameras via her tablet, counting at least 5 figures approaching from the tree line, deliberately avoiding the areas visible from the road where the media vans were parked. Their movement suggested tactical training, staggered approach communication through hand signals, weapons visible in the infrared imaging. This wasn't a random threat, but a coordinated operation. Jade sent an emergency alert through the Sentinel Protocol network, then silently positioned herself and the dogs for defense. She could have called the sheriff, but response time would be at least 15 minutes, and the intruders would reach the house in less than 3. The veterans maintaining watch at the front of the property couldn't see. The approach from the rear. Jade had no illusions about the intruder's intent. This wasn't an arrest attempt, but something more sinister, eliminating a threat to the corruption she had exposed. The planted evidence hadn't worked. The intimidation had failed. So they had escalated to direct action under cover of darkness. Reynolds had likely convinced Wilson that their only option was to silence her permanently and destroy the evidence she had collected. As the figures approached her back porch, Jade saw their faces partially concealed by balaclavas. Despite the disguise, she recognized Reynolds's distinctive build and movement pattern beside him was Officer Delaney, who had planted the evidence earlier. The others appeared to be private security rather than police. Hired muscle. For deniability, one carried what looked like a gasoline can. They intended to burn the house with her, inside destroying evidence and eliminating a witness in one operation that could be disguised as a tragic accident. Realization crystallized Jade's response options. This was no longer about self-defense within legal parameters, but survival against imminent deadly threat. She activated the property's sprinkler system remotely, not for fire prevention yet, but to create confusion and potentially render the accelerant less effective. The sudden spray of water startled the approaching figures, momentarily disrupting their formation in that moment of disorientation. Jade gave Sierra and Titan their tactical deployment, command a single word that unleashed their special operations training. The dogs moved like shadows through the darkness, utilizing stealth techniques developed for hostile territory. Infiltration, Titan circled behind the group, while Sierra approached from the side, both animals invisible in the darkness until they were already in position. The intruders never saw them coming. Sierra's bark, the first sound she had made all day, signaled the beginning of the engagement. The sharp, commanding sound froze. The intruders, in momentary confusion, unable to locate its source in the darkness, Titan simultaneously targeted the man with the gasoline can using a specialized takedown technique that disabled, without lethal force, the precision of the attack. Going directly for the most significant threat demonstrated the dog's advanced tactical assessment capabilities. Reynolds spun around, weapon raised, but Jade had already positioned herself at the corner of the house, her military training evident in her movement and stance. "Federal agents on the property," she shouted, using the presence of the DOD investigation to create uncertainty. "Drop your weapons immediately." The veterans at the front of the property had heard Sierra's signal bark and were already approaching, using their own tactical training to secure the perimeter. The media vans, alerted by the commotion, activated their cameras and lights, flooding the area with sudden brightness that exposed the masked intruders. Reynolds hesitated, caught between retreat and aggression. His weapon still raised, the moment balanced on a knife's edge of potential violence. Then another vehicle appeared. Officer Bennett's personal car, arriving at dangerous speed. He skidded to a halt at the edge of the property, emerging with visible injuries to his face. "They attacked me at my home," he shouted, his voice carrying in the night air. "They said I'd pay for betraying the department." His arrival created a critical distraction. As Reynolds turned toward the new threat, Sierra executed another specialized maneuver, disarming him with a precision bite to the wrist that caused minimal injury while rendering the weapon hand temporarily useless. The other intruders, seeing their leader neutralized and their operation exposed by lights and cameras, began a disorganized retreat toward the trees. They didn't get far. The veterans had established a containment perimeter, and state police units responding to the emergency alert were already blocking the road. Within minutes, the property was secured, the intruders detained, and medical assistance called for Bennett and the injured attackers. Jade checked both dogs carefully for injuries before turning her attention to the young officer who had risked everything by coming forward. "They came to my house," Bennett explained, his voice shaking with a combination of fear and anger. "Said they were just going to talk. Then started beating me when I refused to recant my statement. My wife and baby were inside. I managed to get away, but I knew they'd be coming here next." His courage in coming to warn her, despite his injuries, spoke to the moral conviction that had led him to break ranks in the first place. The security cameras had captured everything. The approach, the gasoline can, the weapons, the attack, combined with Bennett's testimony, and the physical evidence it created an irrefutable case of conspiracy and attempted murder that not even the most corrupt system could easily dismiss. By dawn, the situation had transformed again. FBI agents had taken jurisdiction of the case, citing clear evidence of civil rights violations and criminal conspiracy. Reynolds, Wilson, and their accomplices were in federal custody, facing charges that carried decades of potential prison time. The state attorney general had announced an emergency review of all cases involving the Willow Creek Police Department, with particular attention to property seizures and arrests near the proposed resort development. The media coverage had expanded from local to national, with major networks picking up the story of corruption, racial targeting, and the Veterans Network that had helped expose it. Bennett, despite his injuries, provided comprehensive testimony about the department's systematic harassment of minority property owners. His evidence included internal memos, text messages, and recorded conversations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy from Reynolds and Wilson up through city officials, and to the development company that had financed their operation through untraceable donations to the police. Benevolent fund. The attack had backfired spectacularly, transforming a local corruption case into a federal civil rights investigation that threatened to expose similar operations across the state. Jade's military training had prepared her to recognize that sometimes the most effective victory came not from direct confrontation, but from allowing an opponent to overextend and expose their vulnerabilities. Reynolds' desperate attack had done exactly that, revealing connections and conspiracies that might otherwise have remained hidden. As morning light illuminated her property, now bustling with federal agents and media, Jade allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection with Sierra and Titan at her side. The battle wasn't over. Systems of power fought fiercely to preserve themselves, but the first decisive victory had been won. The shadows had been forced into the light 6 months later. Jade stood before a different kind of formation. Not soldiers or police officers, but a gathering of community members, veterans, and media on the steps of the federal courthouse behind her. The imposing granite facade represented the system that had finally, if imperfectly, delivered a measure of justice. The grand jury indictments had come down. Like thunderclaps, Reynolds and Wilson faced federal charges of civil rights violations, conspiracy, attempted murder, evidence tampering, and corruption. The investigation had expanded beyond Willow Creek, revealing similar patterns in 3 other counties where development interests had used police power to force minority landowners to sell valuable properties at fractions of their worth. The FBI had traced financial connections between police department donation funds and shell companies linked to development corporations, exposing a sophisticated system of legalized corruption that had operated unchallenged for years. Officer Bennett, now recovered from his injuries, stood beside Jade as she addressed the gathered crowd and cameras. His testimony had been instrumental in securing the indictments, his courage in coming forward, inspiring other officers to break the blue wall of silence that had protected corrupt practices. Today isn't about victory. Jade began, her voice carrying across the courthouse plaza. It's about accountability for too long. Systems of power have operated without consequence, particularly when those targeted lack the resources or connections to defend themselves. What happened in Willow Creek wasn't unique or unusual. It was simply exposed. Sierra and Titan sat at perfect attention beside her, their disciplined presence a reminder of the specialized training that had helped turn the tide in the months since the confrontation. They had become unexpected symbols in the community, representing protection and justice rather than aggression. The Sentinel protocol that had activated to protect Jade had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization, Veterans for Community Defense, using their specialized training and understanding of systems. Former military personnel of all backgrounds provided support documentation and protection for communities facing harassment or intimidation. What began as an emergency response network had transformed into a structured advocacy organization with chapters forming in 12 states. Attorney Marcus Gaines stepped forward to discuss the class action civil rights lawsuit that had been filed on behalf of all property owners targeted by the conspiracy. The settlement negotiations were already underway, with developers and municipal insurance funds scrambling to resolve claims before the full extent of their liability became public. The financial compensation matters, Marcus explained. But equally important are the structural reforms included in the settlement: independent civilian oversight of police departments, mandatory body cameras with footage accessible through public records, requests, regular audits of property seizures, and enforcement actions to identify racial patterns. These systemic changes represented the most significant victory addressing root causes rather than merely punishing individual actors. Sheriff Daniels had been appointed interim police chief for Willow Creek during the transition, bringing his more enlightened leadership approach to a department being rebuilt from the ground up. Bennett had been promoted to community liaison officer, working directly with neighborhood representatives to rebuild trust between law enforcement and residents. The journalist who had responded to Jade's security alert, Lisa Chen, had won a regional reporting award for her coverage and subsequent investigation into similar patterns across the state. Her documentary series on police accountability had brought national attention to issues previously dismissed as isolated incidents. Prosecutor Torres had been appointed to a federal task force examining the intersection of development interests and law enforcement, using Willow Creek as a case study in how economic pressures could weaponize police power against vulnerable communities. The most significant transformation, however, had occurred in the community itself. Residents who had previously lived in isolation, each believing their harassment was unique to them, had formed networks of mutual support and information sharing. The Veterans Protection Program had expanded to include training for civilians in documentation, legal rights, and community organizing. Jade had established a specialized program that trained service dogs for veterans with PTSD, creating a dual purpose for her military experience. The training facility built on her property that developers had once coveted now served as both a healing space for traumatized veterans and an educational center for community empowerment. Bennett had become a regular volunteer, finding purpose in helping others navigate systems he once upheld without question. Real justice isn't just about punishment, Jade continued in her courthouse address. It's about transformation of systems, communities, and individuals. What happened in Willow Creek revealed the shadows within our institutions, but also the power of collective action to bring those shadows into the light. As she spoke, a dark SUV pulled up to the courthouse. Federal marshals escorted Reynolds, handcuffed and in detention clothing, toward the entrance for a pre-trial hearing. His eyes met Jade's across the plaza. The man who had tried to intimidate, frame, and ultimately kill her, now reduced to a defendant facing decades in federal prison. There was no triumph in Jade's expression, no gloating or revenge, just the steady gaze of someone who had faced injustice and stood firm against it. The final image captured by the assembled media: Jade Walker, standing tall on the courthouse steps, flanked by Sierra and Titan at perfect attention. As Reynolds was led inside in chains, became symbolic of a larger shift in the national conversation about power, accountability, and justice. The systems that had protected corruption for generations hadn't been dismantled entirely. Such transformations never happened in single moments, but the foundations had been shaken, the cracks exposed, and the possibility of something better revealed. For Jade, the victory wasn't in Reynolds's downfall, but in the community that had formed in response to the threat he represented. As she looked out over the gathered faces, diverse in background, but united in purpose, she recognized something she hadn't felt since leaving military service: the sense of belonging to something larger than herself, a mission worthy of her training and sacrifice. Sierra and Titan remained at her side, their presence a reminder that sometimes the most effective resistance comes not from aggression, but from discipline, training, and the unwavering commitment to protect what matters most. The work continues. Jade concluded her words, both a promise and an invitation to those gathered today is just the beginning. What would you do if faced with injustice in your community? Would you have the courage to stand up like Jade Walker and Officer Bennett did, even when the system seems stacked against you? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can build stronger communities that protect all their members equally. Like this video if you believe in the power of people coming together to create change, even against powerful opposition. Subscribe for more stories of courage and justice in the face of systemic challenges, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how dark the shadows seem, there are always those willing to stand in the light. Thank you for joining me for this story of resistance, resilience, and the long journey toward justice. Jade Walker's story reminds us that systems of power often protect themselves at the expense of justice, particularly for marginalized communities. Yet it also demonstrates how individual courage, when combined with community solidarity, can challenge even the most entrenched corruption. Her military training provided tools to resist injustice, but it was the network of support veterans, journalists, ethical officials that ultimately created lasting change. The transformation wasn't just about punishing bad actors, but rebuilding systems with accountability at their core. Officer Bennett shows that even those within flawed institutions can choose integrity over complicity. When confronted with clear injustice, Sierra and Titan symbolize how specialized skills can be repurposed to protect rather than harm. Perhaps most importantly, this story highlights how isolation serves oppression, while connection builds resistance. When community members recognized their individual harassment as part of a larger pattern, they found strength in collective action. True justice isn't achieved through vengeance, but through dismantling the structures that enable abuse and building something better in their place. What moments of injustice have you witnessed in your own community, and did you feel empowered to speak up? Comment below. If you believe civilian oversight of police departments is essential, or if you've seen the power of community organizing firsthand, have you ever stood up against discrimination like Jade did, or wished you had the courage to do so? Like this video if you believe in the importance of accountability for those in positions of power. Subscribe for more powerful stories of resistance and justice. Share with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone in their struggles against systemic injustice. Thank you for joining this important conversation. And remember, when we stand together against racism and corruption, lasting change becomes possible.